start signing in when they well, welcome everyone. I'm happy everybody could be here at this afternoon. We have some wonderful guests with us today. I'm Miles Wertz from the Baptist Study Center here at Abilene Christian University, and we're joined today to talk about Baptist Women in Ministry with three wonderful guests. First up, we have Anyra Cano. Anyra Cano is originally from El Paso. She got her undergraduate degree from the Baptist University of the Americas and her master's in global leadership from Dallas Baptist, and is currently the Texas Baptist Women in Ministry coordinator. Along the way, she has been pastoring alongside her husband in Fort Worth and served in ministry in a variety of different capacities. We also have with us Meredith Stone. Meredith is the executive director for Baptist Women in Ministry as of August 2020. Meredith is a native Texan, having previously served in ordained roles as teaching pastor and interim pastor in congregations throughout Texas, and is a specialist for women in ministry among Texas Baptist. She has her PhD from Bright Divinity School, and once upon a time, Meredith and I were colleagues. Meredith has been connected to BWIM and involved in advocacy for women in ministry throughout her career for a long time, and has written extensively on these issues in lots of different places. I'll link to some of these as we're going. We also have with us today Jewell London. Jewell is serving on staff right now at the Church Without Walls in Houston, Texas, where she serves as the pastoral assistant to Ralph D. West, the pastor and founder there. She supports Dr. West through a variety of things, but has also been involved in numerous ministry initiatives there to undergird the vision of the pastoral staff, to build momentum, foster ministry developments, and minister to the needs of almost 12,000 families. And so Jewell also travels extensively. He's a member of the board at the Texas Baptist Women in Ministry and has been involved in advocating for women in ministry in a variety of capacities. So we just have a rock star group with us today. So thank you so much for being willing to join us for this time and to visit with us a bit about what it looks like to be women in ministry, what some of your journey has been like. So I want to start us off with a question here. How did each of you first discern a call to ministry? What did that look like? What was that journey like for y'all? Anyra, go ahead and kick us off. Yeah.
First. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us. Well, I was 13 years old when I sensed a call to ministry. I just had a passion. Well, actually, I need to go back further. My dad was the janitor of a church, and we would help him pick up the bulletins after church, and I would take them home. And I'd gather kids from my neighborhood. I would sit them down underneath the tree in my yard and pass out the bulletins and have church with them. And I was always, since I was a little kid, very involved in church and wanting to do things, GAs and a whole bunch of stuff. But at 13, I really sensed I sensed that I needed to be in ministry. I remember being at a conference and hearing a man who was disabled and talking about how he served God. And it touched me to the point to say, I can also serve God. I can also be in ministry. And I remember talking to my pastor about it, which interestingly enough, it was a Southern Baptist church. And my pastor was very supportive of me. And the following Sunday, he shared the news on a Sunday night to the whole congregation, told them that I was wanting to be in ministry and that he wanted them to pray for me and to walk alongside of me as I grew in my walk. And he also immediately enrolled me in missionary trainings around the city. And so I did backyard Bible clubs all through El Paso. You were supposed to be 15 years old in order to do the Bible clubs all by yourself. You would do 4 a day for 6 weeks. And I was the only 13-year-old that was allowed to do it all by herself. I was promoted. And I was there. I helped our youth minister a lot. to plan things, to do things. And I just had this heaviness. I would tell my friends about Jesus. I remember one friend, she got so tired of me telling her she needed Jesus that she was like, yes, 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 I'll accept Jesus. I'm not really sure she was convinced. I think Anyra was just on her too much. And like I said, just growing up, I continued to want and desire to be in ministry. I did per se go astray for a couple of years, and after those years, I remember sensing God telling me, I have called you. I have a calling for you. I have a purpose for you in life, and I need you to go get ready for that. And that's when I was introduced to the Baptist University of the Americas, where I went to go study to be in ministry. And so I've been in ministry ever since then. Mm-hmm.
Jewell, what does that journey look like for you thus far?
I tell you, I absolutely love Anyra's story and how she was involved at such an early age, because I think I probably ran from every opportunity that was presented to me as it relates to church and ministry, except when we were like really little and used to sing in the choir and all of that good stuff. We were always involved or connected with church with growing up, but I can't say that I ever really had a desire to serve outside of normal activities for children. And it wasn't until I was in my young adult years that the Lord really began to speak to me as it relates to ministry. My father was a minister, but parents divorced when I was younger. So I think that probably contributed to some degree as it relates to not really wanting to be involved with church or even as it relates to ministry. But God has a unique sense of humor and will interrupt all of your plans for the work of ministry. I think I was going to school for chemical engineering and I wanted to be a professor and all of this great stuff. And then all of a sudden, God just kind of derailed all of that for ministry. And it got to the point where it just became uncomfortable. And, the Holy Spirit started speaking to me in creative and unique ways. And then all of a sudden, I just knew that the time had come for me to accept what God was calling me to do. And I had a lot of difficulty with that whole discernment process because I grew up in an environment where women just did not serve in ministry, especially not preaching. They were teachers, missionaries, but definitely not preachers. You couldn't even wear pants to church. That's number one. And then secondly, you couldn't go, as a woman, you couldn't go anywhere near the pulpit. So it took a while for me, first of all, to accept that God was actually calling me, then that God was calling me to preach, and then to actually accept that calling. And so it's been well over 25 years now since I have, but it's just not been an easy journey. And that's through family, through church. And so it's taken a lot, and it's amazing how things just kind of come around to where God just creates space for you to live out that calling. But I think part of my journey was coming to just acceptance that one, God did call me, and then two, that he called me to preach.
That's wonderful. I want to ask. I have a couple of questions that are coming up, Jewell, but I want to wait. But hang on, Meredith. Want to tell us a bit about your story? What does this journey look like for you?
Yeah, I'm fascinated to hear, Jewell's story, and I've heard her mention some things like this before, of not even being able to wear pants at church. I think about the process of discerning calling and some of the obstacles that I felt as a woman in being able to discern, but also had some opportunities that maybe things weren't as strict as in some other places. And I grew up, like Anyra talked about, being a church kid, and was finally able as a 17-year-old to voice that I did feel a sense of calling into ministry. But it was a very long process of being able to figure out, like Jewell said, of what that actually looked like. because I hadn't seen women minister role models. I had seen some women ministering in nonprofit kinds of places. And so I thought, well, maybe that's what women do, because I knew I didn't feel called to be a missionary. And I knew that I was not gifted to work with children. And so began to try and discern what that would look like. And as I came across different expressions of ministry more and more, it was almost as if each time I saw something new, I would have to decide, is this for me? Because I'd never seen it before. And so it was little decisions constantly along the way of, okay, now I've seen something else. Do I fit within this role? So as that process went along for me, it probably took a good 10 years before I was able to realize that for me, there were no limitations on the calling that God had placed on my life, that I could preach, I could serve in pastoral kinds of roles. And that began to kind of open up possibilities of what things can look like. And, even throughout the journey of life, we're constantly encountering obstacles, right? Of new things that step into our way of being able to express our calling. And so in recent years, I've really also began to do that internal work of discernment between the difference between a calling of God calling me to a specific occupation and the calling of who God has called me to be, as a minister, as a pastor, as a person. And so even that work along the way, I think is one that we all continue to do.
I like that distinction that you draw between your identity as a minister and the ways in which that's able to play out occupationally or vocationally. I think that's really helpful. So here's a kind of a follow-up question. So I hear in each of your stories, like the way in which, like where you started out and then kind of gradually your mind began to change and you began to become more aware of the ways in which God was calling you. Were there some specific figures along the way that were instrumental in helping you to see that, or maybe to help your mind change? Who were some of those people that for you were most important, and how did they help you do that?
I like to start with this one. There was a time when, because I was in that whole discernment process of one, is God calling me, and then secondly, is he calling me to? What is he calling me to? And one of the challenges that I had was I had a knowing, I knew God was calling me to preach, but yet again, because of my context, I had a difficult time even saying preacher. Literally, it was hard for me to say that God was calling me to preach. And so there was a woman who was invited to the church I was attending, who was a little bit more, they hadn't quite opened up the door for women in ministry just yet. But there was a woman who was invited to sing with a singing group. She's now a pastor, Pastor Tabitha C. Whitten. And she was literally exhorting before the group began to sing, engage in a congregation. But everything on the inside of me began to bubble up to say, I know that's exactly. Now, she wasn't preaching. She hadn't been invited to preach, but just exhort before they were beginning to sing had such an anointing and authority in her voice that I knew that I knew then. And so then all of a sudden, God started surrounding me with female ministers, which became more of an affirmation that this is possible, and I'm talking about beyond what we would see on television with Joyce Meyer and Paula White and, et cetera, but actually persons in my everyday context that I knew and can begin to relate to and begin to learn what this journey could possibly be for me. So that was like the fire that lit the light.
So it's one thing to have someone that you're seeing on TV, but it's quite a different thing to have somebody that's in your life that's able to call that out and to be able to model. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll follow Jewell and say that likewise, I didn't have a lot of female role models. And so some of the people who really shaped my ministry were the people that I saw ministering tangentially. And so in parachurch ministry, as a teenager, I was involved in Young Life, and there were women leaders in Young Life who were not just thought of as second class or not just put on the sidelines, but were truly in charge of things. And being able to see them lead was very influential to me. And I still think about the ways in which the Young Life's model of relational ministry has influenced the way that I think about what it means to be in ministry. But I also had male figures along the way who were people who saw me and were able to validate the call on my life, which was something I needed at that point. And while, you would hope that everyone would be able to come to that on their own and be able to say, yes, I'm a minister, I know who I am. Sometimes we need that external validation, especially from people who we view in authority. And so men like Brady, Chris, Jerry, Bob, some of these folks who saw in me and pointed out gifts and gave me opportunities to be able to explore leadership. It was very formative for me. And I think that's something that as, leaders in the church, as lay people in the church, if we can be folks who see the gifts in others and point that out, we can do so much for encouraging current and next generations into fully living into who God has created people to be. So I'm grateful that I've had both some female figures that I was able to draw from, and then as they added in along the way, but also for the men ministers who have been mentors to me as well.
So I'm similar to Meredith. I've had men in my life, as I shared with you, my pastor growing up. What I really appreciate about him was that he not only heard from me and affirmed from me that I was being called to ministry, he invested time in me. He spent time seeking opportunities for me to serve, whether that was to lead children's church, whether that was to go serve in missions around the city with mission groups. At that time, obviously, I didn't know exactly what God was calling me to, if you could really say God calls you to one thing. But, I just wanted to serve, and I really appreciate all that he invested in me. And, many people can say that they affirm your calling, but there's nothing that shows that, right? There's nothing that is attached to those words. And it was for him. He did put those things into practice and taught me how to do different things. He's the one that told me about the Baptist University Americas. And I have had women in my life who have been those role models to me. Obviously, not many. I've had Alicia Sorsoli, who is a great influence in my life since I was 19 years old. She was the first woman I heard preach at this small Hispanic church that my family and I then moved to. And it was the first time I had ever seen women pick up the offering, do the Lord's Supper. And this is a small Hispanic church in El Paso, and see a woman preach. And let me tell you, the best preacher I had ever heard. And almost till this day, the best preacher. And so I had her. My husband, his mom is a pastor, has been a pastor for many years. And my husband he's the one he's almost like the Holy Spirit in my life. He's constantly pushing me. You have to preach. When are you going to preach? When are you going to do this? When are you going to do that? You need, he wants me. He doesn't want me to, in a sense, fall behind in my calling. He wants me to get more involved. My mother-in-law is one of those other ones that has been a great influence in my life. The first woman in her region that was ordained in Colombia. She was criticized. She was, much like the Lottie Moon story. They wanted her to go serve, but they didn't want her to baptize any of the people that she was serving because she wasn't ordained. And today I have other women in my life that, like Dr. Nora Lozano is another person who invested so much in my life, taught me that God could call women to any expression of ministry. And so that was a big impact in my life, that God could call women to become pastors, which was very different for me. And so I have had many in my life. And one of those other persons is my mom. I remember my mom since I was really little. I always say, you're going to be a preacher. You're going to be a missionary. You're going to be this. You're going to be that. And I think that it says a lot about when parents speak those things into their children's minds, where you could be anything you want to be. But my mom always said, you're going to be a preacher and maybe a lawyer. and I'm a minister who loves to advocate for people. So, that kind of goes together. So my mom was very discerning in my life as to what it was that God was calling me to. And lastly, my congregation. My congregation have been the ones that have been so good at reminding me that what God has called me to. When they introduced me, even before I was ordained, they would say, this is our pastor. And I would, till this day, it freaks me out. It's interesting, right? But they're the ones that would remind me. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm their pastor. And so even my congregation has been the ones who have been so influential in my life when it comes to my calling.
That's wonderful. I love hearing all the different names that are kind of contributing to your own story.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah, please do.
That pastor he came to my ordination, and I had not seen him for over 25 years. And I emailed him out of nowhere, and I said, Pastor Phil, I'm going to be ordained. I hope you can come. And he came.
That's good. I like that. So all of you are actively engaged in one way or another. All three of you have been engaged with Baptist Women in Ministry, the national organization, and at the state level, and are doing so kind of in many different kinds of ways. What are some of the practical things which churches need to be doing in order to support women's ministerial vocations? Like, what are some of the practical things that congregations need to think about?
I've got a lot, Miles. So I was going to let Jewell and Anyra go first so that I could let them. I don't want to take things off their list, but how about I'll give you two to start off with.
Give us two to start off with. We'll double back around. Right.
Number one, employ someone who knows how to use sound systems. If you are going to have women speaking at a microphone, preaching, even reading the scripture, you need to have someone who knows how to tweak the system to the female voice. Because one of the biggest complaints that women tend to hear is, I couldn't hear her because the frequency is higher, or, her voice just sounds so shrill and it's uncomfortable to listen to. Well, sound systems were made in a patriarchal society. And so you have to be able to know how to tweak the sound system for the female voice in order for congregations to begin to have an acceptance of women preachers. And that even starts with women reading the scripture to acclimate people to the female voice. A second thing that I will say that a congregation can do to advocate for women in ministry is to establish and set up a maternity, paternity leave policy for your employees, and be vocal about that with the congregation, because that shows we actually do value women who work here in any role, so much so that we are going to make sure that their whole health is taken care of, and their families and what that looks like. And that we recognize that the family is a unit, and so that there's also paternity leave policies, so that the women and the men join together in the raising of children. I think that is not that hard, right? There are plenty of policies out there, but it can make such a huge difference. And if you talk about it with your congregation, why you're doing it, it implants those consistent ideas that we are employing the belief that truly all people are created in God's image and we value them equally.
I'd like to add on Thank you for mentioning that. I mean, that is so practical as it relates to the sound system, because I've definitely experienced that over the years. In addition to that, I would say congregations should invest as they do me. And what I mean by that is I've seen it time and time again where there have been individuals hired on staff, and I've had these conversations with women, and especially if the one is married, then congregations allow not to need the medical care, or maybe they don't need the level of retirement because they have that by that type of thing. And so I would encourage congregations to treat women as fairly as they do men, benefits, their compensation. And can we talk about that? Would it be and then I would say also respect in their multiple roles. As Meredith was talking about maternity leave, should be respect as it relates to who is just like male pastor who's a parent. And so it seems to be some spoken and unspoken expectations placed not on men, parents, and in pastoral roles. And so that's fairness across with service ministry.
Jewell, I think you're cutting in and out there a bit, but just make sure I heard what you were saying. To advocate equally in terms of pay, and what was the other thing? There was one other thing that you were talking about that I couldn't quite catch.
It was. Can you hear this better?
A little bit, yeah.
See if this works a little bit better. As it relates to roles as women serving themes and history.
I still didn't quite catch it. All right, sorry.
We're having a great conversation, so I really hope this works.
Oh, there it is. Okay, that's better.
Okay, so I was just saying fairness as it relates to women and the roles that they serve, and not only as ministers, but as parents. Sometimes there are unexpected expectations that are placed on women that aren't placed on men as it relates to being a parent. And so just fairness in that area as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Can y'all hear me? Okay, my internet was doing something weird as well. So invest in good internet. No. One of the first things that I can think of is helping those who are thinking of either going to seminary to also study something that has nothing to do with ministry, right? To have a bivocation, because unfortunately, there are going to be women who are going to be able to be called full-time to a church, to a pastorate, and to be able to do ministry bivocationally is very important, not only for her as a minister, but also for the church. As I think about my context, the Latina context, there's Latino pastors already get paid very little. And then to have a woman be paid in a church, in a ministerial role in a Latino church, is really rare. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's very rare. So if you can be able to be bivocational, whether it's in another ministry, nonprofit ministry, or in another sector, that would be very important for women in ministry. And as we're seeing with the pandemic, after the pandemic, Ministry is changing. It's going to change a lot. And the more women could be prepared to be able to work in different areas, not just within the church, is going to be important. And so to teach that, right? To be able to have maybe another career, another degree. So some of these seminaries that have dual degrees, I think that is so important for women in ministry, where they can have 2 degrees and be able to work in 2 different areas. So that's something important that I think churches should be able to teach those who are coming into ministry. The other one I wanted to share is, as a new mom, I will tell you, I have a lot more grace for any women who make it to church on time. It's a lot of work. You have to get yourself ready and the child ready. And, obviously it's a partnership with your husband, but it's still a lot of work, especially if you want their hair to be done nicely. But anyways, one of the benefits that we have had at church is there's a lot of people who love our little girl. And when I get to church, sometimes I have to run and get to do what I have to do. And there's always very key people who really love her and spend time with her and invest time in her. They just grab her and they run wherever they need to take her, whether that's to the nursery, whether that's to back to the sanctuary, wherever they need to keep her, they'll have her. And then at the end of church, once we've said bye to everybody, they bring her back to us and they're like, here, take her. But that has been a lifesaver. It has helped me and my husband, because we both pastor at this church. It has helped us so much, but especially myself, in thinking, oh my goodness, where is my daughter? I want to be with my daughter, but right now I'm doing this. And so to know that she's with people who are safe, who are taking care of her, who are watching out for her and taking her to where she needs to be, means the world. And so maybe having 1 or 2 people in church who that can help with that process, something very practical that's been helpful to me.
Those are all amazing and really practical things. Meredith, go ahead. I know you have
add just a couple. I'll add just a couple. I think this was implied in everything that the 3 of us have been talking about, but we all feel it's really important for women to be involved in public worship leadership, that the stage, the pulpit, the microphones are a place that represents what we believe theologically. It's the moment in the church that is communicating our beliefs to folks. And so having women present and involved in different ways in public worship is so important. And as a part of that, being able to tell the stories of women. How many sermons have you heard that are addressed to anecdotes specifically related to the male experience? Most of them, because most of the time we're hearing men preaching, but women's experiences have just as much theological value. And so anecdotes about women, preaching about the women of the Bible, even when you're thinking about a crowd that's gathered to hear Jesus, guess what? Women were there too, not just men. And we can talk about those women, and we can use language that expresses it's not just men present, but it's people. That Jesus is addressing humanity and all people. And I think that makes a big difference. But not only should we have that same representation in the public worship space coming in those leadership places, I think we also need it in lay leadership as well. When you're thinking about committees, the whether it be deacons or the finance committee or the hospitality committee, are those committees 50-50? Because I imagine there's a lot more women on the hospitality committee, but I imagine there's a lot more men on the finance committee. And honestly, if we're representing the makeup of our congregations, we should have more than 50% women on every committee, because there are more women in our churches than all. So thinking about those lay leadership spaces and how we not only ask women to volunteer, to sign up for these things, but our leaders are actively recruiting women to be a part of lay leadership. Studies about women will tell you that now there are women who break these rules, and as with all stereotypes, there are women who don't fit the stereotype, absolutely, but they're stereotypes for a reason. And so what it tells us, the majority of women are less likely to volunteer for things because women deal more with imposter syndrome. Well, a statistic that I've read is that if there is a job listing that has 5 qualifications, then a man will apply for the job if he meets 3 out of the 5. I can do that. A woman will only apply if she meets 5 out of 5. So a woman is always going to be less likely to volunteer and put herself out there. So we need to be actively recruiting women to be among our lay leadership and be standing up and giving that example so that our whole congregation creates an environment of women are valued and seen and empowered in every space of our congregation.
I love that suggestion.
Can I add to that? Can I add to that one?
Yeah.
And when you go to conferences, when you go to church events, that they would also have women representation. There are events I will not take our students because there's no women representation. And my students have even told me sometimes, there was no women who preached. Where are the women? Or we don't want to go because they don't have women there. And, you know, who are teaching or preaching. And so being careful with that, because we can take them to, you know, kumbaya events that have no women leading. And what are you teaching different than what is happening in your own church?
Those are all wonderful suggestions. I want to follow up on maybe one of the ones, Meredith, that you mentioned briefly. What are some specific resources that folks who are wanting to advocate more strongly for women in leadership, like what are some resources that they can turn to? Here, I'm thinking with respect to one of the things that I know that BWIM is doing is you're reading Will Gaffney's lectionary together. What are some other kinds of things along this line that give people maybe some tools and resources for thinking proactively about how to include women's experience, how to advocate for women in leadership? What are some of those tools that we should be looking to?
Yeah, this is Will Gaffney has produced a new lectionary which highlights the experiences of women in the Bible. And it's not just stories of women, but it's pointing out when women are there that we haven't even thought about it. And it's a beautiful resource that, you know, a church could preach through. She's going to do, right now we're in year W, but she's going to have a year A, B, and C, and it's going to 3 years of preaching women's experience. And I think that's such a great resource. I'd encourage folks to get involved with what Anyra is doing, Texas Baptist Women in Ministry, to get involved with Jewell's ministry. Jewell does wonderful webinars and various events for people to come together and to follow our BWIM resources as well. We're consistently putting out different kinds of resources. We've got maternity policies online that people can use in order to think about what that looks like. We're involved in a clergy sexual misconduct task force, which has produced materials in order to educate both congregations as well as congregational leaders about clergy sexual misconduct. Another one of my list of things that congregations can do is to actually talk about what sexual harassment is, what sexual assault is in your congregations. Since the majority of people who experience that are women, that once again shows as a congregation that you value women's experience and you want to work for them to have a wholeness of life with Christ. And so we've got resources about sexual misconduct online. You know, one of the things that I tell folks when they're saying, I want to advocate for women in ministry and I don't quite know where to start. The first thing that I suggest to them to do is find one woman in ministry that you know, have a conversation with her, ask her what obstacles she has experienced, and just listen. Then commit to that woman that you are going to pray for her, that you are going to spend time advocating for those obstacles that she's experiencing, either for her context or in your context. And I think that's such a great place that people can start. We can talk about this all day, but hearing the stories of one woman that you know and what that looks like, I think it could help open up that door to what advocacy looks like on a larger level.
That's excellent. I think there's, like, you're right, there's no substitution for hearing people's stories on a one-to-one level. It's not just about an experience, but hearing people's experiences firsthand. What are some specific opportunities that you see on the horizon in Texas that exist for more advocacy for women's ministry? Maybe what are some of the specific challenges that you see on the horizon in our context?
So first, you mentioned opportunity. I think one is connecting with Texas Baptist Women in Ministry. When we like to highlight women in ministry, and so many times I hear churches say, well, I don't know many women in ministry or who want to be in ministry. Well, we like to highlight those women, and not only through what we do, but when we see any women in ministry do things, all of us, we're sharing it. We're excited. We're celebrating. Another opportunity is sometimes we have webinars. We'll have one on the 4th of March. We'll have our annual conference. And so, it's going to be a surprise for March 4th. I'll let you know the date later. We'll have our annual conference fall of this year. And so that's another opportunity. Also, I'll be going on the road per se and visiting different regions of Texas to get together with other women in ministry and see what we can do in those different regions. We don't want to say, this region, you do this, because we want Texas BWOM to do that. We want to go hear what different regions want to do as women in ministry, whether that's, let's just get together and debrief and share what we're going through, or maybe we want to read a book together, right? We're not sure. We want to go out and hear those voices. So that's an opportunity that will be coming up soon. And to just stay tuned to what's going on with Texas Baptist Women in Ministry and with Baptist Women in Ministry. We're always doing things together. And we all know that Jewell, just follow Jewell. Jewell does some amazing stuff, even if you just go and just follow her everywhere. So those are some of the opportunities. Some of the challenges continue to be, especially in Texas, we don't have a lot of churches who are hiring women in ministry. And I will tell you something, we talk a lot in Texas about the Latinos growing, right? We are becoming the majority, and yet churches are not hiring Latinas. I see churches hiring Latinos, and we're talking about Anglo churches, but they're not hiring Latinas. I don't know about them hiring even African Americans, hiring Asians. Churches need to step it up and also hire women of color. So that's a challenge that I'm seeing. They're graduating from seminary. They're very well educated, very faithful, and they're not going to have a place to serve in Texas. They're going to go to other states. We're not going to have them here. We're a growing state, and they're not going to be able to stay, or they're going to have to take on positions in other areas. We need to churches need to take advantage, in the good sense, of these women who are well prepared. And then continuing to speak up at denominational meetings. It needs to be the work of all of us who care. It can't just be BWOM, Texas BWOM. It can't just be what Jewell's doing in her ministry. It needs to be all of us. So everyone here, whenever there's not other women or women seated at the table, you need to be asking those questions. Why isn't so-and-so here? Why don't we have more women seated at the table? Why don't we hear from them? And so many times we're not seated at the table because we're not asked. And there are many faithful women who are doing the work. They're out there, but if you don't ask, you're not going to find them. If you
one
seek,
woman
you will
is
find
not
them.
one woman at every table
No.
is not enough.
No, and like Meredith said, at least 50%. And we need, and not only invite them, and this also goes for women in color, not only invite them, but if you're going to invite them, you got to be willing to hear them and to feel convicted and to feel very uncomfortable, but being willing to do something different. Don't just invite them to take the picture. Invite them to make a difference.
Jewell, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I was at that thing, and hopefully you can hear me clearly. One of the things that Meredith said was she also had of her and they were her past. And I'm thinking things. One, important that men show up as kids for women in this, because they're the ones who have a place right now that's more prominent and can help open doors and decisions and encourage others to invite them into the table. That's one thing. The second thing is very important that when we do, was mentioned, a resource, that is what I'm going to say, your resource, information women to women, but be willing to hear, be willing to hear stories, willing to be comfortable. Here's the other thing, don't diminish their stories, don't diminish their challenges, and to hear and difference, make a difference in their life, and be willing to be courageous enough to do that. Take a lot of courage. Just me, say the text with love, born and raised. We have this because
Jewell, I'm still having trouble. Could you maybe try turning off your video? Let's try turning off your video. Maybe that'll help with the.
I really hope this works.
Oh yeah, that's much more clear. All right, there you go. Sorry.
That is amazing. That is, it must be the internet connection. But what I was saying was that two things. One, wasn't sure how much you were able to hear, but being able to, when you have those conversations with women, your greatest resources are women, be able to hear their stories, welcome their stories, be willing to be uncomfortable with those stories. Don't diminish their experiences, but to actually take the pain for what it is, and then figure out how we can work together to make it better. I would also say that men to step in and be advocates, to be courageous in order to do that. It takes both of us at the table, and we know still that men have the greater voice. And so we need them to walk alongside of us to make a difference, to help open doors for women. And like I said before, treating women, giving women some of the same opportunities as it relates to ministry that you do men. And when you as a man see that women are not there to say, we need not just a woman, but we need some women, and we have some capable women, and go out and look for them, find them, invite them to be a part, to make a difference. And so we need your voice where our voice is not welcome yet, to help create space and open doors. That would make a world of difference for so many of us.
I think that's such a good word from Jewell. It takes us together. It takes all of our voices. You asked about challenges, and I think that some of the challenges in Texas mirror what we're seeing in some other places, in that we've got a lot of folks who feel like women in ministry is an issue that we figured out. We decided that we're okay with women in ministry, but we dealt with that a long time ago, and we're done with it. We don't want to talk about it anymore. We've told you that we're fine with that. But when you look, the makeup does not match what we have said. There's a difference between having a head knowledge of affirmation about women in ministry. Yes, we can see how to interpret biblical passages to be in support of women in ministry, and then actually taking that step to turn it into a transformative practice. It's a leap that doesn't happen overnight. And just like Anyra said, it doesn't take just deciding once. We have to keep speaking up over and over and over again in all of the spaces. Oppression that has lasted for thousands and thousands and thousands of years cannot be changed by us just deciding, oh, okay, it's done. No, there's lasting effects, structural issues that are present that we have to continually work to dismantle. And as Anyra talked about too, that has to do with some intersections, especially for women of color, that we're not only dealing with oppression against women, but for women of color, they're fighting also the racism on top of that. And so we have to be willing to address both of those things together if we're truly going to be able to have that voice for advocating for women in ministry, and over and over and over again.
So one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A is there a monthly gathering for women in ministry where we can connect as a whole and learn from one another about things already happening in Texas? Is there something happening through Texas BWIM or otherwise a place where women are able to kind of gather on a regular basis to talk about issues relating to advocacy?
At this time, no. And that's one of the reasons why I will be going on the road per se, to be able to go see what the different regions would like to do, if that's something they want to do in their region or do online. And one of the things that Texas BWIM wants to be intentional about is that we're not doing the same work as BWIM. We're sister organizations, and we're not trying to compete with BWIM. Whatever BWIM is doing, we want to highlight and we want to support. And Texas BWIM is actually a small nonprofit, and I'm the only staff, and I'm part-time. And so, we try to be creative in different ways, whether it's connecting you to different places, connecting you to BWIM or to any other place. And so that's the reason why we want to try to figure out how can we be more supportive locally. And one of the things that Texas BWIM wants to do is to make sure that those pockets of girls, young women, ladies who might not go to denominational meetings, who might not know about what's happening, that they know that there's an organization that is praying for them, is affirming them, wants to encourage them, wants to lift their arms up. And this is any women in ministry, whether you're a pastor, preacher, or a children's minister, and not to make one more than the other, but we want any women who is in ministry to know that we're here for them. Sorry, I answered a little bit more than I was supposed to.
Oh, that's great. So we got a few more minutes left. We've got a couple of questions that are coming in on the Q&A. So this one relates to scripture. So I'm trying to think how to phrase it real quick. When you're thinking about scripture, what should we understand about the voices within scripture relating to women in ministry? What are some of the most important themes? What are some of the things that we should be looking at?
I think if the question has to do kind of with some of the passages that are more limiting to women,
right?
Then one thing that I would really encourage is to think about the fact that, especially the New Testament, we've got multiple voices speaking on different kinds of issues. And so in one place, we have an author, Paul, saying, in Christ, there is no male or female, that all are equal. But then in another place, to a different group of people, because of perhaps a contextual issue, the same author, Paul, is saying that women should be limited. And so I think when we can even see that there are different messages about women in ministry from the same author in the New Testament, that helps us to know that there's some contextual issues happening here that we have to pay attention to. And that context can help us to be able to see that perhaps Paul was talking about specific instances, specific things that were going on, and wasn't necessarily making this universal prohibition against women in ministry for all time. And so I think it's really important when we're doing interpretation that we think about the context. So many passages in the New Testament, we really quickly think about the context and we go, of course, that's not for me. Whenever Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:23, stop drinking only water, drink a little wine. It's good for your stomach. And we go, oh, well, that's contextual. That was just for, Timothy. But we have to think about the fact that all of these things were written as letters to individual groups for particular circumstances. And there was like this whole life context situation that was happening behind it. And that can help us to be able to realize the difference between maybe where context is affecting things versus it being a universal prohibition for everyone.
All right. So last, maybe two more. I think we got time for maybe two more questions. One, what are you reading these days? What are y'all looking to? What sorts of things are helping you inform your own ministries? Putting water in the well. What kinds of things are you looking to?
I am reading one book called Escaping Spiritual Abuse, which is very fascinating, and thinking about what spiritual abuse looks like in the church and how that connects to patriarchal expressions in the church. I'm also reading another book, I'm listening to that one, called The Human Element, which talks about how we affect change beyond simply inspiring change, but how we remove friction that keeps people from being able to adopt the change. So those are the two books I'm working on right now.
Things that I'm reading. One of them is, I say this truthfully, the Bible. And I say that from the perspective that I'm reading it devotionally, as opposed to always preparing for a sermon. That's one thing. And then secondly, I read anything but the Bible. And so that would be marketing books, books as it relates to autobiographies, even books. I mean, just anything that I can get my hands on, and even online, that informs me. History, science, just a wide range. And I'm not actually targeting a particular area, but just something that helps me to see the world differently from what I experience every day.
I am reading a lot of children's books recently. I read a lot of books to my daughter about women of color. But if you want something more profound, I am reading Jesus Feminist by Sarah BC. And it's a book that feeds my soul because, telling the story of Jesus hearing, seeing, being with women, liberating women. And in a time where last year was not a good year for me because of COVID and some of the stuff that Meredith shared about imposter syndrome, just ministry and all of its goodness and also ugliness, I've needed to read something that reminds me that Jesus is with me.
It's good. Okay, so one last question then, as we're getting ready to round out the hour. What is one thing that you would say to your 21-year-old self about vocational ministry that you've learned? A message from yourself to yourself.
I would say shoot for the stars. Meredith summed it up perfectly, even when she started, when she said there really are no limitations for women in ministry. I just didn't realize that I was in a context that didn't support that. So when you know better, you do better. And me to myself now, to my younger self, would be find a safe space where you can grow and develop and become the minister that God designed you to be.
I'm gonna have to piggyback off that Maya Angelou quote, Jewell. When you know better, you do better. Yeah, that's actually even going to be the theme for our 2022 annual gathering this June in Dallas. And we've got Reverend Dr. Gina Stewart coming to be our preacher for that event. She's the president of the Lot Carey Baptist Association. And so I'm just going to go with that and say 21-year-old Meredith could stand to know that she has a lot more to know. And as she comes to know all those new things, she needs to do something with it. She can't just stop by saying, well, I wish I knew. Now that we know, we've got to do better in so many ways. So thank you, Jewell, piggybacking on her answer.
I think mine is similar. It would be to continue, no matter what you go through, continue thinking that you can change the world. But be careful to not become cynical. A lot of people on either side who can make you very cynical, but just continue to focus on what Jesus called you to do, because with Jesus you can change the world.
That is probably the perfect place for us to end. Then, reminder that with Jesus you can change the world. Jewell, Anyra, Meredith, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being willing to share with all of our audience about your experience, about what you're doing, and about how others can be involved with advocacy and what it might look like for the church to do differently. So thank you everyone for your time. We'll make this available online for people to be able to watch offline very soon. And so on behalf of the Baptist Study Center here at ACU, thanks for calling in, and hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Miles, very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.